Hi, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about classification today. This goes along with our evolution unit, and we've been talking about uh, cladograms and dichotomous keys and just ways that organisms are classified um, based on their functions, on how they appear, and even on DNA. And so we're going to look at a little bit more of that today. So, our species of organisms in the world are about 13 billion known species of organisms, and it's really staggering to even acknowledge that there are some that we don't even know about. And this 13 billion that we know about is only about 5% of all organisms that have ever lived. 5%. That is such a small number of all of the organisms that are out there or were out there at one point in time. New organisms are still, to this day, always being found and identified. Um, there's still so many areas that we have not been able to explore when you talk about deep sea and things like that, where we can't actually get to it and really do a really great study of it because of the dangerousness of it. But we know that there are organisms there, and every day scientists are looking to try to identify those. So, what is classification? It's how the organisms are arranged in groups based on their similarities. Okay, they call this whole concept of science taxonomy. So basically, taxonomists are scientists that identify and name organisms. That is their job in life, is to study how to split up organisms and who's related to who, and is this organism related to this organism? You can imagine that when they find a new organism, something new, something no one has ever seen before, how do they know where it goes? So they have to look at, um, really investigate it and look at its functions, look at what it does. They can take DNA, but they can watch it and observe it and see what kind it does to see, okay, does it belong in, with fish, or is it more like a turtle, or is it more like a wolf? I mean, obviously, some of that is going to be pretty obvious and allows them to narrow down where they're going to put it at first. But sometimes a lot more has to go into it to figure out where things belong. So, why it's important that scientists classify and correctly classify organisms is because it gives us a uniform name for everything. You can imagine that common names for things that the common people who are not scientists call things like starfish and jellyfish. Um, they're not fish. So it can confuse people if they say, oh, starfish is not a fish, jellyfish isn't a fish. But if you use the real Latin or Greek name, then it's less confusing for scientists. And so scientists, even no matter what language you're in, it's going to be the same name. So in France and in America, the name for a dog in its actual classification name is going to be the same, so that there is no language barrier and there isn't that kind of uh, misconception. Okay, so they use the same language, Latin or some Greek, for all of the names. Um, this is another example. Seahorse, not a horse at all. Okay, so, but why do we call it a horse? Well, that's its common name. But if you look at its Latin name, there isn't horse in it. We kind of name it that way because it looks like that. But again, if you're looking at, if scientists are comparing things or talking about a seahorse in a article or in documentation, they're using its scientific Latin name. So here's a funny example of the confusion that can happen. If you have a bunch of different people and they all speak a different language, you can imagine they have a different common name for any organism. So here's a picture of a little skunk and all of the different names that people call a skunk. Okay, so they wouldn't know what each one are talking about because they don't know each other's language. However, being scientists, if they use its scientific genus and species name, then they all know what it is, and they are all talking about the same thing. So it eliminates that kind of confusion. So our early taxonomists, these are the guys that started it all, started thinking about, hey, we got all these things running around. We got to start naming them, figuring out a way to name them. So about 2,000 years ago, Aristotle was one of the first taxonomists. He divided organisms into plants and animals, and then he subdivided them into habitat. Like, so he said land animals, sea animals, or air animals. So he looked at, he noticed that there were plants and animals, and he noticed that they were different. And then he also noticed that they lived in different locations. And so that was kind of the first attempt at grouping things and organizing all of the animals and plants and organisms that we know about. John Ray was a botanist, and he was the first to use Latin for naming. His names were very, very long descriptions telling everything about the plant. So that didn't last very long, as you can imagine, because the names of it were just incredibly long and cumbersome, and it was really hard to write about because they were very, very long. So then enters Carolus Linnaeus. This is the man that kind of established taxonomy, and we still use his system today with little tweaks. But he was a taxonomist in the 18th century. He classified organisms based on structure. He developed a naming system, and that naming system is still used today. Okay, so that has held out for a long time. He thought ahead, and he provided enough flexibility in his naming system that we can add to it, and it was big enough to encompass all of the organisms. So it's kind of amazing that he could think that far ahead and think that about how big, how many organisms there possibly could be. I mean, when you think about back in the 18th century, their lives were kind of small, right? They didn't travel the world. They didn't even travel the country, really. So they were just in this one little spot. He'd probably never even seen a giraffe or a elephant or something like that from another continent. So, you know, it's kind of amazing that he came up with this based on where he was at. Okay, so they call him the father of taxonomy. He developed the modern system of naming known as binomial nomenclature. Nomenclature is just a fancy word for naming things, and binomial means two names. So it's a two-word name, and it's just the end, the genus and the species. Like we are Homo sapiens. This is our genus, and this is our species. Okay, our genus is Homo and our species is Sapiens. And so it's a shorthand word. We don't have to say all of the names of an organism to refer to it. We just use the last two, the genus and the species. So he gave us a standardized naming. We called it binomial nomenclature. The genus and the species is used lots of times. It's mostly Latin with some Greek thrown in. When you print it or type it out on a computer, it's usually italicized. So the name of the organism is italicized. And you capitalize genus, but not species. So when I wrote Homo sapiens, see, this one is capital, this one is lowercase. And if you're using a computer, you can italicize it, or if you're writing it by hand, you underline it. Okay. So this is a Turdus migratorius, or the American robin. I kind of think he would prefer this name other than the Turdus migratorius, but however, that is Latin name. And so when species are being referred to, this is the name that scientists would use. All right, so here we have a giant panda, a polar bear, and a grizzly bear. Which two do you think are more closely related? Take a close look. Look at their genus and their species. Which ones do you think are more closely related? All right, well, hopefully you said the grizzly bear and the polar bear, and that is because they both belong to the genus Ursus. And because they belong to the same um, genus, they are more closely related to each other than they are to the giant panda, which belongs to a different genus altogether. All right, so there are names for naming organisms. They have developed an international code for binomial nomenclature, and it has all of the rules for naming organisms. All names have to be approved by the International Naming Congresses and the International Zoological Congress. It sounds very official. And this helps prevent duplicate names because, as you can imagine, there's people all over the world right now studying things and thinking that they're finding new organisms. Well, what if people on a different continent find the same organism and they want to name it something different, or they want to use the same name? So they have to have one entity that is looking at all these names and making sure that only one organism is given one name, and that those names aren't being duplicated. All right, so classification groups. Taxon is a category into which related organisms are placed. So each of the little groups are called taxons. And there is a hierarchy of groups. A hierarchy means it's kind of like how you have a king and you have a prince, and you have the people below that. That's a hierarchy where there's something up here and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller groups. So you have a hierarchy in the classification groups where at the top you have the biggest, broadest category, and then it gets more and more and more small and more specific. Okay, so you have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. These are the names. And there is a fun little mnemonic device to help you remember these. Well, here, I'll get to that in a second. But again, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The domain being the broadest, lots of things fit in there. And species being the most specific. Okay, it's usually talking about one kind of organism, one species. So obviously lots of things up here, big broad umbrella of organisms, very, very specific down here. Okay, so here's that mnemonic device. Dumb King Philip came over for gooseberry soup. So D for domain, king for kingdom, P for phylum, C for class, O for order, F for family, G for genus, S for species. Dumb King Philip came over for gooseberry soup. So if you can kind of remember that silly little song or silly little saying, then it'll help you put these in order of most broad to most specific. Okay, so again, if you're looking at this, if you look at, for example, class Mammalia, lots of things fit into this class Mammalia. Everything from the polar bears to grizzly bears, panda bears, fox, and a squirrel all belong in class Mammalia. But as you go down and get more and more and more specific, now we get down to where the Ursus arctos is down there all by itself. Okay, so you can trace a common, it still belongs in the same kingdom as the sea star, but obviously it's not very closely related to it since it's in one of the biggest, broadest categories. Okay, so this is a classification of humans. We are in the domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae, genus Homo, species Sapiens, Homo sapiens. Okay, so each of these groups then have characteristics that go with them. To be put into domain Eukarya, you have to have cells with a nucleus, or nuclei for plural. To be put into kingdom Animalia, you have to be multicellular, you have to be modal, means you have to be able to move, and you have to ingest food as your source of energy. Phylum Chordata means that there is a dorsal supporting rod, which sounds like a really crazy thing, but it's talking about a backbone basically, and a nerve cord. Then class Mammalia has hair and mammary glands. Mammary glands are what women and female organisms feed their babies with. So the mammary glands. Order Primates is adapted for climbing in trees. Yes, we are adapted for climbing in trees, meaning that we have a thumb that allows us to grip things. Family Hominidae, it's because we can walk standing up. Then genus Homo, because we have a large brain and we use tools. And then Homo sapiens, because we have body proportions of a modern human. So that is how we classify humans. Long, long list, and that puts us very broad up here, very specific down here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 domains. There's only 3 domains, and we'll get to these here in a little bit. But at first, I want to say that this is the broadest, the biggest group. Everything. Remember, we talked about those 13 billion, and it's only 5% of the species organisms. All of those fit into 3 domains. 3 domains. That's it. So obviously, just because you share a domain doesn't mean you're very closely related. Okay, so this is like the biggest, broadest category. Archaea and bacteria is 1. Archaea is 1. Bacteria is 2. And eukarya is 3. These are the 3 domains: Archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Archaea and bacteria are pretty more related because they are both unicellular prokaryotes. Unicellular prokaryotes. We're going to talk a little bit about what prokaryotes mean in a little bit. Eukarya are more complex, and they have a nucleus and they have a membrane-bound organelles because they are eukaryotes. Okay, these 2 words, this prokaryote and eukaryotes, that's referring to the type of cells the organisms in these groups are made up of. Okay, and we'll get to those in another couple of days, but just know that these ones are prokaryotes, these ones are eukaryotes, and that's kind of what divides them.